My name is Aisha. I am 32 years old, and last Thanksgiving I let my family believe I was a broken woman. I let them think I was a burden relying on a walker to get across the room. I sat on the floor of my parents' sprawling Washington mansion listening to them laugh after my younger sister violently shoved my walker away. They had no idea I was a forensic financial auditor and the anonymous CEO of a $500 million investment firm, or that my husband was standing right behind them ready to tear their fake high society lives apart. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a toxic family. The dining room of my parents' house in the elite suburbs of Washington was designed to intimidate. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany table, which was weighed down by my mother Yvonne and her obsessive need for perfection. The floral centerpieces completely obstructed my view of my father Calvin sitting at the head of the table. To anyone looking through the windows, we were the ultimate picture of Black excellence. A family deeply embedded in the most exclusive social circles, dedicated to our megachurch and dripping with generational wealth. But the reality inside was suffocating. I sat near the end of the table gripping my napkin. For 2 hours, I had endured a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive insults disguised as familial concern. My younger sister Sierra, the undisputed golden child, held court in her designer silk dress. At 28, she styled herself as a luxury lifestyle influencer. Beside her sat her husband Preston. Preston was a white man who bragged about his old money lineage and used his race to assert dominance over my parents, who were tragically eager for his validation. I tried to focus on my plate, but the conversation turned toward my perceived failures. Sierra took a sip of wine and asked if I was still struggling to find remote work, since my physical condition made me so unreliable. My mother chimed in, adjusting her pearl necklace and sighing loudly. She lamented how difficult it was to explain my situation to the women at her social club. I took a deep breath and quietly reminded them that I was managing my finances just fine. That was the wrong thing to say. Sierra slammed her wine glass down, her influencer smile twisting into something ugly. She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the hardwood floor, making the table fall silent. Before I could register it, Sierra marched over to where I sat. My walker was parked right next to my chair, my lifeline for the past few years. Without a word of warning, she snatched the metal frame with both hands. I reached out to stop her, but she violently shoved the walker across the room. It skidded wildly over the wood, crashing into a sideboard with a loud clang. My chair tipped and gravity took over. I hit the floor hard, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up my spine. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs. I lay there staring at the expensive rug, trying to process the malice of what had just happened. Above me, Sierra stood with her hands on her hips. She looked down at me with a smirk that chilled me to the bone. "Let us see how disabled you really are," she sneered. I expected someone to rush to my side. I expected my father, a respected elder at our church, to reprimand her. Instead, a chilling sound filled the dining room: laughter. My mother covered her mouth, giggling as if Sierra had just delivered a brilliant punchline. My father chuckled while pouring another glass of bourbon. But the loudest laugh came from Preston. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his expensive wine, and pointed at me, writhing on the floor. "She is probably practicing her slip-and-fall routine for insurance money," Preston mocked, his tone dripping with condescension. "You have to admit she really sells the helpless act." I gripped the leg of the dining table, my knuckles turning white. The physical pain of the fall was nothing compared to the emotional whiplash of hearing my own flesh and blood laugh at my expense. They truly believed I was a broken, helpless charity case. They genuinely thought I was living off a meager disability check, a stain on their flawless family image. I did not cry. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I tightened my grip on the table leg, preparing to drag myself up without my walker. I hated being pitied. Just as I managed to get one knee under me, the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung wide open. The laughter died down instantly. My husband Xavier walked through. Xavier was a crisis manager for corporate clients, a man whose entire career was built on staying ruthlessly calm. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his presence immediately commanding the room. He took in the scene before him, the overturned chair, the walker shoved against the wall, and me struggling on the floor. A lesser man would have rushed over in a panic, causing a scene. But Xavier knew me better than anyone. He knew I needed to stand up on my own terms. He did not rush to pick me up. He did not yell. He simply walked into the room with slow, deliberate steps. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. My mother straightened her posture, suddenly looking nervous. My father set his bourbon down. Preston shifted uncomfortably, trying to maintain his arrogant smirk, but failing miserably. Xavier ignored my parents completely. He stopped right in front of the table, his dark eyes locking onto Sierra. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen once, looking directly at my sister, and dropped 5 words that would change our lives forever. The wire transfer just bounced. The heavy silence that followed was deafening. Sierra's smug, triumphant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Beside her, the color completely drained from Preston's face, leaving him looking sickly pale. My mother, Yvonne, shattered the silence. She did not rush to my side. She did not ask if I was hurt from the violent fall. Instead, she leaped from her custom-upholstered dining chair, with a look of pure disgust directed entirely at me. She marched over her designer heels, clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She stepped directly over my legs, careful not to let the hem of her expensive silk dress brush against my clothes. But she did not reach out a hand to help me up. Instead, she kicked my walker out of sight, shoving it roughly into the dark corner behind the heavy velvet window curtains. "Stop embarrassing us, Aisha," she hissed, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper meant to keep the neighbors from hearing our dysfunction. "Pastor Hughes is arriving any minute for the holiday blessing, and you have ruined our family image enough with this pathetic, crippled act. Get off the floor right now before someone important sees you." I stayed on my knees, looking up at the woman who had given birth to me. Her main concern was not my spine or the painful throb in my hip after hitting the floor. It was the pastor of our elite megachurch walking in and seeing a less than perfect tableau. I pushed myself up slowly, gripping the edge of the massive mahogany table, refusing to let her see me wince. I had spent years hiding my true strength, testing them to see if they would ever show me an ounce of genuine grace. Tonight proved they were completely incapable of it. While my mother was busy worrying about her high society optics, Preston decided it was his time to play the hero. He puffed out his chest and took an aggressive step toward Xavier. Preston was tall and always carried himself with that specific brand of arrogant confidence reserved for wealthy white men who believed the rules simply did not apply to them. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and glared at my husband, trying to establish dominance in a room where he had none. "Listen here, Xavier Preston," said his voice dripping with loud condescension. "I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing with my wife and her family, but you need to back off right now. You are acting like a thug in my in-laws' house." Xavier did not flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for Preston to finish his pathetic performance. Preston mistook Xavier's calm, quiet demeanor for hesitation and doubled down. He took another step forward, invading Xavier's personal space, pointing a finger directly at my husband's chest. "Maybe you forgot who you are talking to." Preston sneered, a nasty smile forming on his lips. "My family has deep ties in this city. My uncle is a state senator and he plays golf with the governor. I can make one phone call right now and have your little crisis management firm audited so fast your head will spin. We can have your licenses revoked and make sure you never work in the corporate sector again. You do not want to mess with old money, Xavier. I will ruin you for disrespecting my wife." The absolute audacity of the threat hung heavily in the air. Preston truly believed his skin color and his supposed family wealth gave him the ultimate authority in this dining room. My father Calvin nodded approvingly in the background, always eager to align himself with Preston and his perceived power. My father actually thought having a white son-in-law from a prestigious family elevated our own status in the wealthy black elite circles of Washington. But my father was a blind fool, and Preston was a massive liar. Xavier let out a low, rumbling laugh that echoed against the crystal chandeliers. It was not a nervous laugh or a defensive one. It was the sound of a predator cornering its prey. He reached into his tailored jacket and slowly pulled out a sleek black tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, the blue light reflecting in his dark, intelligent eyes. Then he held the tablet out, presenting it directly to Preston. "Take a good look at this old money," Xavier said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. Preston snatched the tablet, his jaw clenched in anger, ready to dismiss whatever he saw. But as his eyes scanned the screen, the arrogant swagger completely evaporated from his posture. His hands began to tremble so violently, he almost dropped the device onto the floor. I knew exactly what was on that screen. It was a live feed of Preston private offshore bank accounts. The exact same accounts he used to hide the money he was secretly funneling out of the country. And right across the top of the financial dashboard in bright red letters was the word "frozen." "What is this?" Preston choked out, his voice suddenly an octave higher, losing all its previous bravado. "What did you do to my accounts?" Xavier calmly adjusted his cuffs, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "My firm specializes in financial security and corporate fraud containment." Preston. "About an hour ago, my team noticed some highly suspicious offshore wire transfers originating from your personal accounts. Naturally, as a responsible corporate citizen, I had my security team flag the unusual activity directly to the federal authorities. They froze your entire portfolio, pending a full criminal investigation. Every single cent you thought you had access to is currently locked down tight." My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace, as if the very concept of frozen bank accounts offended her delicate elite sensibilities. My father stepped forward, looking utterly confused and slightly panicked. "What is he talking about, Preston?" my father asked, his voice wavering with uncertainty. "Why would the federal government freeze your money?" Preston was sweating profusely now. Tiny beads of moisture gathered on his forehead, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "It is a mistake," Preston stammered, handing the tablet back to Xavier as if the metal burned his fingers. "It is just a ridiculous bank error. My trust fund manager probably triggered a routine security hold by moving some large assets around. I will call my family estate lawyers tomorrow morning and have this whole misunderstanding cleared up immediately. You are going to pay for this stunt, Xavier." But Xavier just smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made my heart race with anticipation. He took the tablet back and slid it smoothly into his jacket pocket. "A trust fund manager," Xavier mused, stepping closer to Preston until they were standing chest to chest, forcing the taller man to look down at him. "That is a fascinating excuse, but it brings up a very interesting question." Xavier's voice dropped, lowering to a dangerous whisper that still carried perfectly across the dead, silent dining room. "Tell me something, Preston. How exactly are you paying for a luxury trust fund manager? How exactly are you funding this lavish lifestyle, buying sports cars, and funding my sister fake influencer vacations? How are you doing all of that when your precious old money family formally disowned you and cut you off without a single dime 5 years ago?" The silence in the dining room was suffocating. Preston stood frozen, unable to formulate a lie to save himself. Sierra looked from the tablet to her husband's pale, sweating face, and the reality of their financial ruin registered in her eyes. The fake influencer lifestyle was a house of cards that had just collapsed. But instead of turning her anger toward the man who had been lying to her, Sierra did what she had been trained to do. She deflected. She spun around, pointing a manicured finger directly down at me where I was kneeling on the rug. "You owe us!" Sierra screamed, her voice cracking with a hysterical edge. "How dare your husband come into this house and threaten us? We are the only reason you are not living on the streets, Aisha. We paid for everything. We paid your medical bills when you got into that car crash. We put a roof over your head while you sat around feeling sorry for yourself. You are a leech, draining this family dry." Her words were meant to inflict maximum damage. Xavier immediately stepped forward, extending his hand down to me. his eyes filled with a quiet, protective fury. But I looked up at him and gave a barely perceptible shake of my head. I refused his hand. I did not want to be rescued right now. I reached out and clamped my hands onto the carved edge of the dining table. My knuckles turned white from the strain as I hauled my dead weight upward. Every muscle in my back burned in protest, but I forced myself to rise. I ignored the shooting pain radiating from my hip. I dragged myself up inch by agonizing inch until I was finally on my feet, leaning heavily against the polished wood. I stood tall, refusing to break eye contact with the people who had spent their entire lives trying to break me. I had waited years for this exact moment to arrive. I did not look at Sierra. I turned my gaze directly to the head of the table where my father sat. Calvin was watching me with a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. "My crash?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, cutting through the lingering echoes of my sister's screaming. "You mean the crash where Sierra was driving blackout drunk after that stupid country club party? You mean the crash where she lost control of the wheel and wrapped your prized silver Mercedes around a massive oak tree?" The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Sierra's face drained of all color, her mouth snapping shut as if she had just been slapped. My mother Yvonne let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as she looked frantically from me to my father. Nobody had spoken of that night in years. The narrative had always been that I was a careless driver who ruined my own life through negligence. My father's face turned a dark, violent shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. "Shut your mouth, Aisha!" he roared, slamming his fist down onto the table with such force that the crystal glasses rattled. "You have no right to speak to your sister that way." I stubbornly held my ground. "I have every right," I countered, keeping my voice steady while his was completely out of control. "Because I was the one who woke up in a hospital bed with a crushed spine while the rest of you carried on with your perfect lives." In his blind rage to protect his favorite daughter, my father completely lost whatever filter he usually maintained. "We did what we had to do," he yelled, his voice raw with years of buried guilt. Sierra was 20 years old. She was the front runner for the Miss Maryland pageant. She had early admission pending at an Ivy League university. A driving under the influence charge would have destroyed her entire future. We could not let one foolish mistake ruin everything she had worked for. I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me, feeling a fresh wave of disgust wash over my soul. "So you forged the police report," I pushed, forcing him to admit the full extent of his depravity aloud. "You paid off the responding officer." My father's chest heaved as he leaned forward, his hands planted firmly on the table. "You were already unconscious, Aisha." He spat out the cruelest words a parent could ever say to their child. "You were practically in a coma. Your legs were crushed. Your life was already ruined that night. We did not see the point in letting two lives be destroyed when only one had to take the fall. So yes, we pulled you out of the passenger side. We dragged your broken body across the console, and we put you in the driver's seat before the ambulance arrived. You were going to be disabled anyway. It made sense for you to take the blame." The sheer monstrous reality of his confession hung in the air. He had admitted to framing his own comatose daughter. He manipulated a crime scene to protect a spoiled pageant queen. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly out of terror that the ugly truth was finally out. Sierra was trembling violently, backing away from the table. Xavier stood beside me, his jaw locked tight, holding back the urge to physically destroy the man standing at the head of the table. But I did not need Xavier to fight this battle for me. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not ask why they did not love me. Instead, a slow, deliberate smirk spread across my face. I looked at my father, watching his self-righteous anger curdle into confusion as he registered my lack of devastation. "I know, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational tone that sliced through his panic. "I have known the absolute truth for a very long time, and I kept the original hospital blood tox report from the night of the crash. The one that proved I was completely sober and my sister was 3 times over the legal limit. I paused, letting the weight of my words press down on his chest. I submitted it to your insurance company yesterday afternoon. The silence that followed my declaration was so absolute you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I watched the words sink into my father's mind. The sheer weight of those words shattered the pristine facade my parents had spent years meticulously constructing. My mother let out a shrill, terrified gasp. The crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending dark red liquid splashing across the toe of her expensive silk pumps. But she did not even look down. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic, staring at me as if I had just detonated a bomb in her perfect dining room. "Insurance fraud is a federal crime!" she shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual refined upper-crust tone. "Calvin, they are going to send us to prison. We will lose everything. The country club, the house, the church board." She began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as her perfectly manicured world burned down around her. In her state of total hysteria, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She turned to the white man in the room for salvation. My mother lunged across the space and grabbed Preston by the arm, her manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his expensive suit. "Preston, you have to do something," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "Call your uncle. Call the senator. You have to use your family connections to make this go away. Tell them it was a clerical error. Tell them Aisha is mentally unstable and stole the documents. Just fix it before the authorities show up at my front door." Preston looked at her with wild, cornered eyes. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by the frantic sweat of a man who knew he was trapped. He violently yanked his arm out of my mother's grasp, stumbling backward until he hit the edge of the sideboard. "Fix it!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "How am I supposed to fix it, Yvonne? Your husband just admitted to a felony in front of a corporate crisis manager. I cannot call my uncle. I cannot call anyone." Sierra stepped forward, her face contorted in a mixture of fear and rage. "What do you mean you cannot call anyone?" she demanded, jabbing a finger at her husband. "You told me your family could bury anything. You told me your trust fund had a legal defense provision. Call your lawyers right now and make them silence her." Before my mother could offer another pathetic excuse, a sudden violent sound interrupted her. It was a heavy, authoritative knocking at the front door. The loud thuds echoed through the massive foyer, striking terror into the heart of everyone in the dining room. My mother screamed, clapping her hands over her ears. My father stumbled backward, knocking a chair over in his sheer panic. "It is the police!" Calvin shouted, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He looked at Xavier with pure hatred. "You called the federal authorities on us, you bastard! You brought the police to my house!" The heavy knocking sounded again, louder and more insistent this time. Someone began aggressively ringing the doorbell. I turned away from my cowering parents and walked slowly out of the dining room toward the grand entryway. I peered through the narrow glass panels framing the heavy mahogany front door. It was not the police. It was someone much worse for my mother. Standing on the front porch with a face like thunder was Mrs. Dubois, the notoriously ruthless and terrifyingly powerful president of my mother elite society club. The exact same women whose money Sierra had just stolen to fund her fake influencer lifestyle. She was clutching a thick stack of bank statements, and she did not look like she was here for a friendly social visit. The silence in the dining room was so absolute you could hear the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. My father stared at the crisp paper in his trembling hands, completely unable to process the massive legal weight of what he was reading. The horrific reality of his absolute financial destruction was staring him right in the face. But before he could even form a single coherent sentence, a shrill, grating sound shattered the quiet. It was Sierra. She threw her head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed harshly off the high, vaulted ceilings. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and looked down her nose at me, as if I were a pathetic child, playing a ridiculous imaginary game. "You are completely delusional, Aisha," she scoffed, her voice dripping with absolute venom and superiority. Do you honestly expect any of us to believe this garbage you just printed off the internet? You are just a bluffing, unemployed loser trying to scare us because you have absolutely nothing else going on in your miserable, pathetic life. You cannot call in any debt because you are entirely broke. You do not have the money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone purchase hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest commercial loans. You are pathetic, and this little revenge fantasy of yours is frankly embarrassing to watch. Sierra strutted forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. She tossed her long, expensive extensions over her shoulder, radiating a sickening sense of unearned arrogance. While you sit around in your little apartment making up fake financial documents, my real life is actually thriving, she boasted, her eyes wide with manic pride. My luxury event company is the premier planning service in this entire city. I just secured a massive $1 million contract this morning to plan the annual spring gala for the most exclusive clients in Washington. The prestigious women of the Boule trust me completely to handle their elite high society affairs. I am a highly successful business owner making my own legitimate fortune. You are just a bitter cripple who is jealous of everything I have built. I did not even have to say a single word in response. Xavier simply tapped the screen of his tablet and placed it on the dining table right over my trembling hands. The bright blue light illuminated a complex web of banking transactions and offshore wire transfers. Your luxury event company is nothing but a spectacularly poorly constructed Ponzi scheme, Sierra. Xavier said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. As a professional corporate fraud investigator, I must admit your methods are almost insulting in their amateurish execution. Sierra stopped pacing instantly. Her smug, superior smile vanished, replaced by a tight, pale mask of sheer panic. "Shut up!" she snapped, lunging forward and trying to snatch the tablet, but Xavier calmly slid it out of her reach. "You have not planned a single legitimate event in over 2 years." Xavier continued, his tone perfectly smooth and relentless. "What you have actually been doing is taking massive upfront cash deposits from your mother elite Washington society friends. You deliberately used your mother standing in the Boule to gain their blind absolute trust. You knew those wealthy women would never question the daughter of their own club treasurer. You preyed on their elite connections to fund your pathetic shopping sprees. You secure $50,000 from a senator wife here and $100,000 from a lobbyist there, promising them lavish galas and exclusive charity balls. But you never book a venue. You never hire catering or secure permits. Instead, you take their new deposit money and immediately wire it to your personal offshore accounts to pay for your fake influencer vacations to Dubai and Paris. When the older clients start asking for their refunds because their events were mysteriously canceled, you simply steal a deposit from a new client to pay the old one back. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, and it has completely collapsed today. You do not have $1 million contract. You have $1 million deficit and a trail of extremely angry high society victims actively looking for their stolen money. Sierra opened her mouth to deny the accusations, but no words came out. She looked utterly terrified, searching the room for an escape route that did not exist. I turned my attention back to my parents, fully expecting them to look shocked or horrified by the revelation that their golden daughter was committing massive wire fraud. Instead, my mother was wringing her hands together in silent terror, and my father was staring at the floor, completely unable to meet my gaze. A cold, creeping dread moved through my veins. "You knew," I whispered, the horrible realization hitting me with the force of a freight train. "You knew she was running a fraudulent company this whole time." Calvin finally looked up, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "We had to help her," he pleaded, his voice weak and highly defensive. "Her credit was completely destroyed after she crashed my car and racked up all those credit card bills. She desperately needed a clean guarantor to secure the initial business loans to get the event planning company off the ground. We signed the fraudulent guarantor documents while you were still lying in the rehabilitation clinic, Aisha, fighting just to learn how to walk again. You were barely speaking to us anyway, so we figured you would never find out what we did. We honestly believed Sierra would launch a successful luxury brand, and we could quietly remove your name from the accounts before it ever affected your credit score. We thought she was actually going to build a real business. We thought she was going to turn it all around and finally make us proud. I stared at him, feeling my chest tighten painfully as the ultimate betrayal finally settled into place. You used my stolen social security number again, I stated, my voice hollow with total disbelief. You willingly let her use my identity as the financial guarantor for a fraudulent Ponzi scheme. My mother let out a loud, pathetic sob. We intended to pay it all off, Aisha, she cried, reaching out a trembling hand toward me. We were going to transfer the business loans out of your name as soon as Sierra made her first big profit. But she just kept taking more money, and we got in way too deep to stop her without exposing ourselves. You willingly sacrificed my entire financial future so your pageant queen daughter could play pretend on the internet, I said, shaking my head in pure disgust. You sold my identity to fund a criminal enterprise and protect your precious image. Before my mother could offer another pathetic excuse, a sudden violent sound interrupted her. It was a heavy, authoritative knocking at the front door. The loud thuds echoed through the massive foyer, striking terror into the heart of everyone in the dining room. My mother screamed, clapping her hands over her ears. My father stumbled backward, knocking a heavy antique chair over in his sheer panic. It is the police! Calvin shouted, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He looked at Xavier with pure, unadulterated hatred. You called the federal authorities on us, you bastard. You brought the police to my house. The heavy knocking sounded again, louder and significantly more insistent this time. Someone began aggressively ringing the doorbell over and over. I turned away from my cowering parents and walked slowly out of the dining room toward the grand entryway. I peered through the narrow glass panels framing the heavy mahogany front door. It was not the police. It was someone much worse for my mother. Standing on the front porch with a face like absolute thunder was Mrs. Dubois, the notoriously ruthless and terrifyingly powerful president of my mother elite society club, the Boule. I did not even have to open the heavy mahogany door because Mrs. Dubois pushed her way inside before Xavier could even turn the brass handle. She stormed into the grand foyer, bringing a gust of cold, damp air with her. She marched straight past the expensive artwork and the crystal vases without offering a single word of greeting. Her formidable presence completely absorbed the remaining oxygen in the house. She was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, and her face was set in a mask of absolute fury. Mrs. Dubois was the terrifyingly powerful president of my mother elite society club, and she commanded respect wherever she went. She walked directly into the dining room, her sharp heels striking the floorboards like a judge slamming a gavel. My mother let out a strangled gasp and tried to stand up, but her legs seemed to fail her. Mrs. Dubois ignored my father completely and marched right up to the end of the table where Sierra was still frozen in sheer panic. With a swift and violent motion, Mrs. Dubois reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp piece of paper. She slammed it down onto the polished mahogany table with so much force that the crystal wine glasses rattled. It was a check. The bold black numbers written across the front clearly read $100,000. I watched the color completely drain from my mother's face as she recognized the signature on the bottom line. Mrs. Dubois stared at Sierra with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The bank manager called me directly on my personal cell phone this morning. Mrs. Dubois said, her voice eerily calm but vibrating with lethal anger. He called to inform me that the generous charity donation you presented at our gala last night had completely bounced. He told me that your luxury event company business account has insufficient funds and has been completely frozen due to suspicious offshore wire transfers. You handed me a worthless piece of paper in front of the entire board of directors and completely humiliated me. My mother let out a loud, tragic wail. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her high society status and her position as the club treasurer. The Boule was her entire world. The realization that her golden daughter had just defrauded the most powerful woman in Washington hit her like a physical blow. Yvonne lost all sense of decorum and pride. She literally dropped to her knees right there on the hard dining room floor. Her expensive silk dress pooled around her as she began to weep hysterically. She did not apologize to Mrs. Dubois. Instead, she scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees and grabbed the hem of my tailored blazer. "Aisha, please," she begged, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. She looked up at me with mascara running down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "You have to fix this, Aisha. Use whatever savings you have to pay Mrs. Dubois right now. You just said you bought all of our debt, so you must have the cash. Please just write her a check and cover this bounce donation. Do not let our family be completely humiliated in front of all our elite friends. We will lose everything if we are kicked out of the society." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me, groveling at my feet like a pathetic child. I felt absolutely no pity for her. There was only a profound and hollow sense of disgust settling deep in my chest. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her to release her desperate grip on my clothing. "You have a tremendous amount of nerve asking me for anything," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that commanded the silent room. "You stood right there and watched my sister violently throw my mobility walker across the room. You watched me struggle and suffer in a rehabilitation clinic for months, while you both plotted to steal my identity and ruin my financial future. You forged my signature on fraudulent loan documents while I was in a medically induced coma. And now you expect me to hand over my hard-earned money just to save your pathetic pride and your fake social standing. You are truly delusional if you think I will ever help you again." I turned away from my weeping mother and faced Mrs. Dubois. I looked the formidable society president dead in the eye. "I am not going to write you a check, Mrs. Dubois," I stated clearly and confidently. "And neither is Sierra, because she is completely broke. She does not own a legitimate luxury event company. She has been running a massive Ponzi scheme for the last 2 years, using her mother elite connections to scam innocent people. She took your upfront deposits and wired the cash to personal offshore accounts to pay for her fake influencer lifestyle on the internet. And my parents are not innocent bystanders in this scheme either. They actively acted as her willing accomplices. They forged my signature to act as the financial guarantor for her initial business loans, knowing full well she had no real revenue. You have not just been dealing with an incompetent event planner, Mrs. Dubois. You have been dealing with a family of desperate common criminals." Mrs. Dubois stood in cold, terrifying silence as she absorbed the massive scale of the deception. Her sharp eyes darted from the bounced check on the table to Sierra's terrified face, and then down to my mother, who was still sobbing on the floor. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure, absolute judgment. She looked at Yvonne as if she were a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "You are completely finished in this town, Yvonne," Mrs. Dubois announced, her voice dripping with lethal finality. She reached into her handbag again and pulled out her sleek smartphone. She began dialing a number without taking her eyes off my parents. "I am calling the rest of the society board members right this second," Mrs. Dubois promised. "I am going to make sure every single elite family in Washington knows exactly what you and your fraudulent daughter have done. Your social life is entirely over. You will be a complete pariah in this city before the sun goes down tonight." As the utter destruction of their precious family reputation crashed down around them, absolute panic fully set in. My father was gripping his chest, breathing heavily, while my mother continued to wail on the floor. Sierra was staring at Mrs. Dubois, in a state of catatonic shock. But while everyone was completely distracted by the society president making her career. Ending phone call, the biggest coward in the room decided to finally make his move. Preston had been sweating profusely and backing away from the dining table ever since the word fraud was mentioned. His eyes darted nervously around the grand room, searching for any possible exit. He realized the money tree had completely withered, and the authorities were undoubtedly going to be involved very soon. He did not say a single word in defense of his wife or his wealthy in-laws. Instead, he slowly pivoted on his heel, hoping no one would notice his silent retreat. Preston took 2 quiet steps backward and then suddenly turned and tried to slip out the back door to make his pathetic escape. As Preston scurried out the back door like the pathetic coward he truly was, he left his fake wife to face her absolute ruin entirely alone. Sierra did not even try to stop him or call out his name. She simply slumped into a heavy wooden chair, staring blankly at the wall as her entire fraudulent empire crumbled into fine dust around her. On the other side of the room, Mrs. Dubois was pacing back and forth with her sleek smartphone pressed tightly to her ear. Her voice was cold and ruthlessly efficient as she spoke to the other senior board members of the society. She systematically detailed every single one of Sierra's financial crimes and made it completely clear that Yvonne was an active, willing accomplice in the massive theft of their charity funds. I watched my mother curl into a tight, pathetic ball on the floor, weeping uncontrollably as she listened to her precious social standing being publicly executed broadcast to the very women she had spent decades trying to impress. The grand dining room that had hosted so many elite dinner parties and church gatherings now felt exactly like a cold, dark tomb. The sheer weight of the absolute destruction finally snapped whatever was left of my father's sanity. Calvin stood up straight and squared his broad shoulders, trying desperately to reclaim the commanding, intimidating presence he used to dominate his large congregation every single Sunday. His face was flushed with a terrifying mixture of deep humiliation and blind, irrational rage. He knew he could not punish Mrs. Dubois because she held all the cards, and he would never punish his golden child Sierra because she was a reflection of his own immense vanity. So he turned all of his furious, desperate wrath directly onto me. He pointed a trembling, thick finger at my face and ordered me to leave his property immediately. "Get out of my house, Aisha," he bellowed, his deep baritone voice shaking the heavy crystal chandelier hanging directly above us. "You brought this terrible destruction into our home today. We were a highly respected family before you decided to ruin us with your bitter jealousy and your endless lies. You are a terrible curse on this family, and I want you out of my sight this very second. Leave this house right now and never come back." I did not flinch. I did not step back or look away from his furious, glaring eyes. I simply stood there, feeling a profound and beautiful sense of absolute peace settle over my entire body. I had waited for years for this exact moment to finally arrive. I turned slightly to Xavier, who was standing silently and protectively by my side. He reached into his slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me with a slight nod of professional respect, knowing exactly what was about to happen. I opened the heavy envelope and pulled out a crisp, thick document bearing the official raised seal of the Washington Real Estate Registry. I placed it gently on the mahogany dining table, right next to the bounced charity check that had just ruined my mother life forever. My father stopped yelling instantly. His broad chest was heaving as he stared down at the complex legal document. He did not want to look at it, but he could not force his eyes away from the bold black text at the top of the page. "What is this garbage?" he demanded, his voice completely losing its booming confidence and dropping into a nervous, raspy whisper. "Is this another one of your fake internet printouts designed to scare us?" I shook my head slowly, keeping my gaze locked on his terrified, sweating face. 2 years ago, you were secretly facing total foreclosure on this magnificent estate, Dad. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady in the quiet room. You had taken out massive secret secondary mortgages to silently cover all of Sierra's terrible business debts and to fund her lavish, expensive lifestyle so nobody would know the truth. You thought you could hide the impending financial ruin from the church elders and from Mother, but the bank was literally days away from seizing this property and throwing you out onto the street. You were absolutely desperate and completely out of viable options. Calvin swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He knew exactly what I was talking about, because it had been his darkest, most shameful secret. And then, a sudden, incredible miracle happened. I continued walking slowly around the edge of the large, expensive dining table. A mysterious private investment group called Vanguard Equity Firm swooped in at the very last second. They bought the house entirely in cash, paying off your massive bank debts and preventing a humiliating public foreclosure. They even allowed you to continue living here rent-free under a highly confidential long-term residential lease agreement. You told Mother it was a divine blessing from above. You bragged to your entire congregation that your unwavering faith had been directly rewarded with a financial miracle that saved your home. My father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Vanguard Equity saved this family, he whispered defensively, trying desperately to convince himself that his reality was still somehow intact. They recognized my high standing in the community and made a sound real estate investment based on my sterling reputation. I stopped walking and stood directly in front of him, blocking his view of everything else in the room. "There was no divine blessing, Dad," I said softly, leaning in close so he could hear every single devastating syllable clearly. "I am Vanguard Equity. I formed the holding company through a blind trust, using the very first major profits from my forensic auditing firm. I bought this entire estate out from under you while you were busy stealing my identity. You have been living under my roof for the last 2 years." The silence that followed was so profound it felt like all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. My mother stopped her pathetic crying and stared up at me from the floor with her mouth hanging wide open. Sierra slowly looked up from her chair, her tear-stained face frozen in absolute utter horror. Calvin staggered backward, bumping into the wall as if I had physically struck him across the face. He looked down at the official deed on the table and saw the legal signature transferring complete ownership of the massive property to my private firm. He realized in that agonizing, terrifying second that he owned absolutely nothing in this world. His stolen money was gone, his pristine reputation was entirely destroyed, and the very roof over his head legally belonged to the disabled daughter he had abused and discarded without a second thought. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was a formal legal notice printed on bright white stationery. I slid it across the polished wood table until it rested right in front of his shaking hands. "I am terminating your residential lease effective immediately," I said, throwing his own cruel, horrible words right back into his face. "You have a 24-hour eviction notice. Pack your bags, Dad. Failures do not belong here." The crisp white eviction notice sat on the table like a live grenade. Calvin stared at it, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He was completely broken. The grand illusion of his righteous, wealthy life had been entirely shattered and handed back to him as a 24-hour notice to vacate. My mother was still weeping on the floor. Her designer dress ruined, her social standing evaporated. Sierra was completely silent for the first time in her life, her mouth hanging open as she realized the massive scope of her failure. But the silence did not last long. Preston had been hovering near the doorway, trapped like a cornered rat. His entire world had just collapsed. The fake wealthy aesthetic he had cultivated by marrying Sierra was gone. The endless supply of church funds he had been siphoning from my father was gone. And now, the multi-million-dollar mansion he had been living in, rent-free, was being repossessed by the very woman he had mocked and discarded. The sheer, absolute reality of his utter ruin finally snapped his mind. He lost the smug, calculating demeanor of a professional con artist and devolved into pure, unadulterated animalistic rage. He let out a guttural roar of absolute fury. His face contorted into an ugly red mask of pure hatred as his eyes locked onto me. In his twisted mind, I was the sole reason his perfect parasitic life had been destroyed. He lunged forward, his heavy boots thudding violently against the polished hardwood floor. He was a large man driven entirely by the desperate need to physically punish the person who had exposed his pathetic fraud. He raised his fist, intending to strike me right in the face, intending to break me physically, just as I had broken him financially. Xavier reacted instantly. His body tensed, his muscles coiling like a lethal spring as he moved to intercept the attack. He stepped smoothly in front of me, ready to drop Preston to the floor and neutralize the violent threat. But I did not shrink back. I did not cower or cry out for protection. Instead, I raised my right hand and placed it gently against Xavier's broad chest. It was a silent, absolute command. Xavier stopped immediately, holding his position, but keeping his highly trained eyes locked dead onto Preston. I wanted to handle this myself. Preston was entirely blinded by his own momentum and his sheer violent rage. He swung his heavy arm forward, aiming directly for my head. But he completely miscalculated my reality. He expected me to cower. He expected me to stumble on my weakened legs and fall helplessly to the floor, just like the fragile, crippled sister they all believed me to be. I did not stumble. I did not fall. With absolute flawless precision, I shifted my body weight perfectly onto my right leg. I pivoted my hips smoothly and stepped gracefully out of his path. The movement was incredibly fast and entirely fluid. Preston swung at empty air. His heavy momentum carried him awkwardly forward. He stumbled clumsily past me, his boots skidding wildly against the polished floorboards before he crashed heavily into the mahogany dining table. The antique wood groaned under his sudden weight, and several empty wine glasses shattered loudly onto the ground. I turned to face him. I pulled my shoulders back and lifted my chin. I stood perfectly straight. My spine was perfectly aligned. My legs were planted firmly and completely solid on the ground beneath me. There was no hunch in my posture. There was absolutely no tremor in my limbs. The agonizing chronic pain that had defined my physical existence for years was entirely absent. I possessed a flawless, commanding balance. The entire room froze in a state of absolute shock. The hysterical weeping from my mother abruptly stopped. Calvin slowly raised his head from the eviction notice, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer disbelief as he stared at my perfectly straight posture. Sierra scrambled backward away from the table, her hands flying up to cover her open mouth. Preston pushed himself off the edge of the dining table, breathing heavily, his face pale with sudden terrifying realization. They were all staring at my legs. They were looking at me as if they were witnessing a genuine physical impossibility. "You can walk," Calvin whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and profound confusion. "You are standing perfectly still." "I have not needed a mobility aid for over a full year," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the grand silent room. "While all of you were busy stealing my identity, forging my signature on fraudulent documents, and funneling cash into fake influencer brands and offshore accounts, I was working. I paid for elite private physical therapy entirely out of my own pocket. I spent grueling, agonizing hours every single day rebuilding my own body from the ground up. I endured absolute hell to repair the damage Sierra caused when she drunkenly crashed that car. I fought for my own life while you were actively trying to completely destroy it." I slowly turned my head and looked across the expansive dining room. Lying discarded in the far corner near the heavy velvet curtains was my medical walker. Sierra had violently kicked it across the floor earlier in her arrogant fit of rage, completely dismissing my physical boundaries. It looked sad and cheap lying there on its side, a symbol of the profound weakness they all associated with my name. I began to walk toward it. I did not drag my feet. I did not limp or lean against the heavy furniture for support. Every single step I took was measured, powerful, and entirely commanding. The rhythmic clicking of my tailored shoes against the hardwood floor sounded like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of their miserable charade. I crossed the massive room with effortless grace, feeling the horrified gaze of my family burning into my back. I reached the corner and looked down at the discarded metal frame. I calmly bent down, keeping my back perfectly straight, and picked the walker up off the floor. The cheap aluminum felt cold and entirely useless in my strong hands. I turned back around to face my utterly ruined family. I held the walker horizontally, gripping it tightly with both hands. I raised my right knee slightly and brought the metal frame down hard against it in one swift, violently powerful motion. The loud, sharp crack of the cheap aluminum snapping perfectly in half echoed like a gunshot through the silent house. The metal completely bent and collapsed under my physical strength. I dropped the broken, useless pieces of the frame onto the expensive rug, where they landed with a dull, pathetic thud. I looked at Calvin and Yvonne and Sierra and Preston staring at their terrified pale faces. I only kept using it around you people, to see if you would ever show me an ounce of genuine empathy when you thought I was broken. I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that promised absolutely no mercy. You failed the test. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of Calvin struggling to breathe. He stared at the broken pieces of the aluminum walker lying on his expensive rug, and then slowly moved his gaze back up to my perfectly straight legs. His mind simply could not process the physical reality standing right in front of him. He had seen the hospital scans himself 2 years ago. He had spoken to the top neurosurgeons in the state. He shook his heavy head back and forth as if trying to physically dislodge the truth from his brain. But your spine was completely crushed, Calvin stammered, his deep voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wheeze. The doctors told us you would be paralyzed forever. They looked us right in the eye and said you would never walk again without permanent medical aid. I looked at the man who had used my tragic accident as a convenient prop for his Sunday sermons. You listen to doctors who operate strictly within the boundaries of conventional medicine, Dad. I replied, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the cavernous room. But when you have real power and real capital, you are no longer bound by conventional limits. You do not just accept a devastating prognosis when you can afford to literally buy the cure. My mother let out a confused, whimpering sound from her spot on the floor. Sierra was completely frozen, staring at my legs as if I were a terrifying apparition. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, just to watch them flinch. I did not just build a highly successful forensic accounting firm, I explained, letting each word sink like a heavy stone into their chests. My auditing business generated massive amounts of liquid capital very quickly because I was brilliant at hunting down corporate fraud. While you were all busy spending stolen church funds on leased luxury cars and fake designer handbags, I took my first major profits and acquired a struggling medical technology startup in Boston. They were on the absolute brink of bankruptcy, but they possessed brilliant researchers and incredibly promising clinical data. Calvin stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the staggering scale of my secret life began to dawn on him. I bought the entire biotech company outright. I continued my tone completely conversational, but laced with lethal precision. I poured millions of dollars into their research and development division. I personally funded the specific clinical trials for a groundbreaking experimental nerve regeneration therapy. I was not just their primary financial backer. I was their very first human test subject. The room remained dead silent as they listened to the sheer magnitude of my determination. It was the most agonizing, grueling physical process imaginable, I told them, feeling a cold spark of triumph as Sierra visibly recoiled in horror. I spent months locked in private offshore medical facilities, undergoing highly classified experimental treatments that pushed my body to the absolute breaking point. I endured unspeakable physical agony to rebuild the neural pathways that Sierra destroyed when she selfishly wrapped her car around that tree. And then I spent another entire year in grueling secret physical therapy, learning how to stand and walk with flawless, perfect balance. You thought I was just sitting at home in a dark room collecting government disability checks? I asked, tilting my head and offering them a chilling smile. You thought I was a pathetic, helpless cripple dependent on your meager charity. I watched you all roll your eyes every single time I struggled to lift myself out of a chair. I listened to you, Yvonne, whispering to your elite society friends about the heavy, tragic burden of caring for your disabled daughter. You milked my physical pain for endless country club sympathy points while treating me like an absolute nuisance behind closed doors. My mother closed her eyes and began to sob quietly into her hands, finally realizing how utterly foolish she had been. But while you were throwing lavish pity parties for yourselves, I was sitting in my bedroom negotiating global medical patents. I declared, my voice rising with undeniable power. I was on secure international video calls with pharmaceutical giants in Geneva and Tokyo. I was quietly building a massive international biotech empire right under your very noses. I secured the exclusive global rights to the exact same nerve regeneration technology that completely cured my paralysis. I hold the ultimate keys to a medical revolution, and you thought my biggest accomplishment of the day was managing to drag my walker across your foyer. Calvin literally had to grip the back of a dining chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The staggering financial difference between his pathetic fake wealth and my actual legitimate empire was completely breaking his mind. He had sold his soul and risked federal prison just to pretend to be a millionaire, while his discarded disabled daughter had quietly become a titan of global industry. Xavier stepped forward smoothly, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence that had fallen over my ruined family. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a man who dealt exclusively in high-stakes corporate warfare. He raised his left arm and casually checked the face of his extremely expensive luxury watch. The polished silver caught the light from the crystal chandelier above us. "Speaking of your global medical patents," Aisha, Xavier said, his deep voice cutting through the room with smooth, professional detachment. "I just received the final confirmation message from our lead underwriters on Wall Street. Everything is perfectly in place for the opening bell." He looked directly at Calvin, whose face was now a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. "Aisha Medical Technology Company officially launches its initial public offering tomorrow morning," Xavier announced casually, delivering the final, absolutely devastating blow. "The global market demand for her proprietary nerve regeneration therapy is completely unprecedented. The final confirmed valuation of her biotech firm ahead of tomorrow morning launch is exactly $500 million. The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. $500 million. It was a figure so massive, so entirely out of the realm of their desperate, pathetic reality, that it completely vaporized whatever remaining sanity my father possessed. He had just been evicted from a house he did not own, because his golden child had bounced a miserable $100,000 check. And tomorrow morning, the daughter he had abused and discarded as a worthless cripple was going to ring the bell on Wall Street and officially become a half-billionaire. You could actually hear the precise moment that Sierra's spirit completely snapped in half. She let out a bizarre, hollow choking sound and buried her face in her arms, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her own pathetic failure. She was going to face federal prison for a cheap local Ponzi scheme, while her older sister conquered the global medical industry. My mother lay on the floor, a completely ruined, broken woman, mourning the loss of the ultimate social status she could have had if she had only shown me a single drop of genuine love. I looked at my father, who was now openly weeping silently, shedding tears of absolute ultimate defeat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. The reckoning was entirely complete, and their total destruction was a masterpiece. The heavy silence that followed my massive revelation was supposed to be the absolute end of their resistance. I fully expected them to remain shattered on the floor, utterly broken by the crushing weight of their own monumental failures. But I had momentarily underestimated the sheer terrifying depth of my parents' delusional greed. The staggering figure of $500 million hung in the quiet air of the dining room, shimmering like a twisted golden mirage. It did not take long for that massive number to completely rewire their broken brains. I watched in sheer fascination and absolute disgust as the horror and shame vanished from my mother's face in the blink of an eye. The tears of ultimate defeat dried up instantly on her cheeks. Yvonne slowly lifted her head from the polished hardwood floor, and her expression shifted into something truly grotesque. The sheer gravity of $500 million acted like a powerful drug, instantly curing her hysterical despair and replacing it with a sickening, overwhelming wave of pure financial lust. She scrambled to her feet, brushing the invisible dust off her ruined designer silk dress with frantic, trembling hands. She hurriedly wiped the smeared mascara from under her eyes and forced her facial features into a chilling mask of intense maternal affection. It was the exact same fake, loving smile she used when posing for Elite Society magazine photographers, but this time it was directed entirely at me. She took a swift, eager step toward me, her arms outstretched wide, fully intending to pull me into a tight, loving embrace. My brilliant daughter Yvonne cried out, her voice dripping with an artificial sugary sweetness that made my stomach physically churn. She tried to wrap her arms around my shoulders, but Xavier smoothly and effortlessly stepped directly into her path. He formed a solid, impenetrable wall of tailored muscle between us, blocking her completely. Yvonne did not even seem to care that she was being physically repelled by my elite security detail. She simply leaned around Xavier's broad shoulder, her eyes wide and shining with a manic, desperate, greedy light. "I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Aisha," she gushed, clasping her hands together in front of her chest as if she were praying to me. "I always told your father that your brilliant mind was your absolute greatest asset. We knew you were special from the very beginning. You have made us so incredibly proud today. As a family, we share everything, right? This immense financial success is a beautiful divine blessing for all of us to enjoy together." I stood perfectly still, staring at the woman who had just minutes ago plotted to steal my identity and ruin my life. Before I could even respond to her outrageous, sickening display of fake affection, my father decided to join her absolute delusion. Calvin quickly followed her lead, straightening his posture and adjusting his expensive silk tie. He cleared his throat loudly, dusting off his tailored jacket, as if the formal eviction notice sitting on the mahogany table did not even exist. He puffed out his broad chest and slipped right back into his commanding, authoritative pastoral voice, completely ignoring his golden child Sierra, who was still sobbing pathetically in her chair. "Your mother is absolutely right," Calvin proclaimed, stepping up beside Yvonne and offering me a magnanimous, forgiving smile that made my blood run cold. "The Lord truly works in mysterious and wonderful ways. You were clearly chosen by a higher power to elevate this entire family to the next glorious level of prosperity. Now, as the patriarch of this household, I am willing to completely forgive your earlier disrespect and your harsh words. We can put all of this ugly business behind us and move forward together as a united, wealthy family. In exchange for my endless grace and to properly compensate us for the decades we spent raising you, feeding you, and keeping a roof over your head, I think a modest 10% family equity stake in your biotech firm is more than fair. It is the absolute least you can do to pay us back for everything we have done for you." I stared at the two of them, completely stunned by their sheer unimaginable audacity. They had literally just been exposed as desperate criminals. They had been publicly humiliated by the society president. They had been legally evicted from the mansion they did not even own. Yet somehow, in their deeply narcissistic minds, they still genuinely believed they were entitled to the fruits of my grueling labor. They were seriously standing in my house, asking me to hand over $50 million as a reward for their basic parental obligations. A low, cold laugh started deep in my chest. It bubbled up into my throat until I threw my head back and laughed out loud. The sound echoed brightly and sharply across the grand dining room, cutting through the heavy tension like a perfectly sharpened blade. I laughed so hard that tears actually pricked the corners of my eyes. Calvin and Yvonne exchanged nervous, confused glances, their greedy, expectant smiles faltering slightly as they realized I was not crying tears of joyful reconciliation. "You want a 10% family equity stake," I repeated, letting the utter absurdity of his demand ring through the air. "You honestly think you are entitled to $50 million because you did the absolute bare minimum required by law to keep a child alive? You want me to reward you for years of relentless emotional abuse and extreme neglect?" I stopped laughing entirely. I let every ounce of amusement drain from my face, leaving behind a mask of cold, hardened stone. I looked my father dead in the eye and watched the false confidence begin to melt away from his sweating forehead. "You seem to have a very short memory, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You are conveniently forgetting the massive fraudulent loans you and Mother took out under my name. You used my private Social Security number to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal funding while I was lying helpless in a hospital bed fighting for my very life. You forged my signature to fund Sierra's fake influencer lifestyle while I was trapped in a medically induced coma. Calvin opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, but I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. Xavier reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a pristine white legal document sealed with a federal court stamp. I held it up so my parents could see the bold red lettering at the top. By federal law, perpetrators of identity theft automatically forfeit any legal right to claim dependency, equity, or inheritance from their victims. I stated, my voice echoing with total, absolute finality. You legally severed yourselves from my wealth the moment you forged my signature. My parents stood completely paralyzed as the brutal reality of federal identity theft laws finally registered in their greedy minds. The brilliant loophole they thought would secure them a massive fortune had instantly become their ultimate prison. The quiet in the room was absolute until it was suddenly shattered by a rapid, relentless buzzing sound. The noise was coming from the far corner of the dining room where Sierra was still slumped in her chair. Her sleek pink smartphone was vibrating violently against the polished wood table. It buzzed once, then twice, then erupted into a continuous, endless stream of notification chimes that sounded like a panicked alarm. Sierra slowly tore her terrified gaze away from me and looked down at her glowing screen. I watched her perfectly manicured hands tremble as she reached out and picked up the device. The sudden drastic change in her expression was something I will never forget for the rest of my life. Her eyes widened so far they looked like they might actually pop out of her skull. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp that sounded like she was physically suffocating. Her face turned an alarming shade of chalk white as she furiously scrolled through her screen, her thumbs moving with frantic, desperate speed. She began muttering to herself, shaking her head back and forth in complete and utter denial. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical shrill pitch that physically hurt my ears. She shot up from her chair and pointed a shaking finger directly at the hallway where Preston was leaning casually against the doorframe. Preston did not look like a ruined man anymore. Instead, he wore a deeply unsettling, arrogant smirk on his face. He held his own phone up in the air, displaying a live recording screen to the entire room. "While your father was busy yelling and you were busy crying, I decided to share this beautiful family reunion with the rest of the world." Preston sneered, his voice dripping with pure malicious vindication. "I hit the go live button on your precious account about 20 minutes ago, sweetheart." The full weight of his horrific confession dropped onto Sierra like a massive concrete block. Over 500,000 loyal followers had just watched the entire unedited meltdown live from our dining room. They heard Mrs. Dubois expose the bounced charity check. They heard me detail the massive offshore wire transfers and the fake business loans. Worst of all, they heard Sierra admit that her entire luxury event planning company was a massive fraudulent scheme built entirely on stolen money and desperate lies. They heard her confess that her marriage was a total sham, designed just to keep the church money flowing. Preston had broadcast her complete criminal confession to 500,000 people out of pure vindictive spite. No, this cannot be happening!" Sierra sobbed frantically, tapping her screen as the digital destruction of her entire life unfolded in real time. I watched a fresh wave of utter despair wash over her as she read the incoming messages. The notifications were not from concerned friends or loyal fans. They were urgent, furious emails from her major corporate sponsors. A luxury cosmetics brand officially terminated her six-figure contract, effective immediately. A high-end travel agency publicly denounced her on their own page. Hundreds of thousands of angry comments were flooding in, tearing her apart for stealing charity money and faking her perfect life. Her entire carefully curated online aesthetic was burning to the ground right before her very eyes, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The fallout was not just limited to Sierra. My father realized with a sickening jolt that members of his own congregation were actively watching the live stream. The devoted followers who had trusted him with their hard-earned money were currently listening to the undeniable proof of his deep financial corruption. His pristine reputation as a moral, spiritual leader was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. My mother covered her face with her hands, knowing that her elite society friends were undoubtedly sharing the broadcast among themselves, laughing at her ultimate downfall. Their entire world was turning to ash. Preston let out a loud, cruel bark of laughter. He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a swaggering step into the room, clearly enjoying the absolute devastation he had just caused. "You honestly thought you could humiliate me and discard me like a piece of trash?" he mocked, pointing at his weeping wife. "You thought you were so much better than me because of your fake wealth and your pathetic internet fame. Well, look at you now, Sierra. You are completely ruined. You are going to be a massive laughingstock, and nobody is ever going to sponsor your pathetic fake life ever again. I told you that if I was going down, I was taking you right down to the bottom with me." He threw his head back and laughed again, fully believing he had just executed the ultimate masterstroke of revenge. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, having successfully destroyed the woman who had dragged him down. He genuinely believed that his spiteful actions had somehow absolved him of his own deep guilt. But his arrogant gloating was abruptly cut short. Xavier moved with terrifying silent speed, completely crossing the dining room before Preston could even react. Xavier stepped right into his personal space, towering over the pathetic con artist with an aura of absolute lethal authority. Preston instantly stopped laughing. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting nervously as he found himself trapped between the heavy wooden doorway and my elite security director. Xavier reached out and smoothly plucked the smartphone right out of Preston's trembling hand. He glanced down at the glowing screen, noting that the live broadcast was still running, perfectly capturing every single moment of the confrontation. "You really should not have turned your camera on, Preston." "Xavier," said his deep voice, completely calm, but carrying a dark, lethal promise. "You were so busy trying to destroy your wife that you completely forgot who else was talking in this room. You just broadcast yourself standing right here listening as Aisha detailed the exact financial mechanisms of your massive church embezzlement scheme. You literally just filmed yourself confirming your active participation in a massive federal crime to 500,000 digital witnesses." Preston's face drained of all color as the horrific reality of his own stupid mistake finally registered. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He had wanted to destroy Sierra, but he had completely forgotten that the live stream was also recording his own absolute ruin. Xavier casually tapped the screen of the phone, completely ending the live broadcast. He tossed the expensive device onto a nearby chair and looked back down at the sweating, terrified man. "My legal team was actively monitoring the entire broadcast from the very beginning," Xavier stated, a cold, sharp smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They have already archived the pristine high-definition footage on our secure private servers. And they just forwarded this live public confession of your massive church embezzlement straight to the district attorney." Preston stood completely frozen, staring at the blank screen of his phone as Xavier's words echoed in the silent room. The reality of his own digital destruction had finally pierced his arrogant skull. He had literally handed the district attorney a perfectly packaged confession wrapped in his own spiteful hubris. He opened his mouth to argue, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. Preston realized that his desperate need to publicly humiliate his wife had just guaranteed his own extended stay in a federal penitentiary. He dropped the expensive phone onto the floor as if the device itself had suddenly caught fire. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting frantically around the expansive room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. Before anyone could even process the sheer magnitude of Preston's catastrophic blunder, a sudden violent shift in the atmosphere occurred. Flashing red and blue lights began to pulse violently through the towering custom windows of the dining room. The harsh strobing colors painted the expensive velvet curtains and the antique mahogany furniture in alternating shades of aggressive crimson and icy blue. The unmistakable sound of heavy tires crushing the gravel in the circular driveway signaled that the authorities had officially arrived. Xavier had not just forwarded a video to the authorities, he had coordinated a precise tactical strike with local and federal law enforcement. The walls of their fraudulent empire were finally caving in. The arrival of the police triggered a massive wave of raw animalistic panic across the room. Sierra let out a high-pitched shriek and scrambled backward until her spine hit the expensive wallpaper. She looked like a trapped rabbit darting her wide, terrified eyes toward the heavy oak front doors. Calvin and Yvonne reacted with the exact self-serving cowardice I had always known they possessed. The grand illusion of their united wealthy family shattered instantly under the threat of federal prison. The very people who had preached about loyalty and unconditional love were now scrambling to save their own miserable skins. They did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second before turning on the man they had happily welcomed into their criminal fold. Calvin lunged toward Preston, his face twisted into an ugly mask of desperate self-preservation. Yvonne was right beside him, pointing a manicured finger directly at Preston's chest. They began shouting over each other, preparing the exact narrative they would feed to the police. It was all him, Calvin declared, his voice booming with righteous fake indignation. He is the mastermind behind all of this financial corruption. He used his position at the church to manipulate the accounting systems, and he dragged our innocent, vulnerable daughter right into his twisted schemes. We had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind closed doors. Yvonne nodded frantically, stepping in front of Sierra as if shielding her from a dangerous predator. Preston took advantage of our pure Christian generosity. Yvonne cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed victimhood. He manipulated our sweet, trusting Sierra. He is an outsider who came into our sacred community and poisoned everything he touched. We are just innocent victims of his terrible, deceitful nature. He controlled the finances, and he forced her to play along with his horrible, fraudulent business. Preston stared at his in-laws with a look of absolute profound betrayal. The white son-in-law, who had happily siphoned money alongside them, was now being served up on a silver platter to save their own miserable skins. He shook his head wildly, stepping away from Calvin, aggressive posture. "You are both crazy," Preston stammered, his voice cracking with pure fear. "You were the ones demanding more cash from the church accounts every single month. You practically begged me to funnel those donations into your fake charity shell companies. Do not pretend you are innocent victims, you greedy parasitic frauds." The heavy oak front doors swung open with a loud, definitive crash. 4 uniformed police officers moved swiftly into the grand foyer, followed immediately by a sharp-looking lead detective in a dark, tailored suit. The detective possessed a cold, professional demeanor that instantly silenced the chaotic screaming match between my parents and Preston. The flashing emergency lights outside cast long, shifting shadows across his face as he surveyed the ruined family standing in the dining room. Calvin immediately stepped forward, ready to unleash his pathetic scapegoat narrative onto the detective. He opened his mouth to deliver his sermon of innocence, but I moved faster. I stepped smoothly in front of my father, completely cutting him off. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single ounce of panic or fear. I possessed the absolute calm of a woman who had already won the war. I reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers and retrieved a small, sleek silver flash drive. The metal felt cool and heavy against my palm. It was the physical culmination of countless grueling hours of forensic auditing and relentless absolute determination. I extended my hand and offered the drive directly to the lead detective. He looked at me with a steady gaze before taking the small device from my hand. This drive contains the complete unedited forensic accounting data, verifying every single fraudulent transaction that has occurred within this family. I stated, my voice echoing with icy clarity in the silent room. You will find the exact routing numbers and offshore account details proving Preston's massive church embezzlement scheme. You will find the complete digital paper trail exposing the fake sponsorships and stolen funds that built Sierra's pathetic Ponzi scheme. And most importantly, you will find the verified federal bank records proving that Calvin and Yvonne committed aggravated identity theft by forging my signature on multiple high-interest loans. Every single document has been meticulously verified by elite independent auditors and cross-referenced with federal tax records. The lead detective slipped the silver flash drive into his jacket pocket and gave me a single respectful nod. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly how bulletproof my forensic evidence would be. Calvin let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his broad shoulders collapsing as the full weight of his impending doom finally crushed his spirit. Yvonne stared at the floor, her hands trembling violently at her sides. They realized in that exact moment that their desperate attempt to blame everything on Preston was completely, utterly useless. The digital footprints did not lie, and I had preserved every single one of them. The detective turned his attention away from me and focused his cold, hard gaze entirely on Preston. The con artist was visibly sweating, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths as he realized his entire fake life was over. "Preston, you are under arrest for grand theft, fraud, and federal embezzlement," the detective announced, his voice cutting through the room with absolute lethal authority. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, instantly grabbing Preston's arms and forcibly twisting them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly in the grand dining room. Preston did not even try to fight back. He simply dropped his head, his spirit completely broken as the officers began reading him his rights. Sierra let out a massive, trembling breath of relief. She pressed her hand against her chest, falsely, believing that, because her husband was taking the fall, she had somehow miraculously escaped the nightmare. She actually managed to summon a faint, pathetic smile, thinking her parents' scapegoat narrative had actually worked. She thought she was going to walk away and play the innocent, manipulated victim. But her relief was entirely premature. The lead detective did not stop with Preston. He slowly turned his body and locked his cold, unforgiving eyes directly onto my sister. He stepped forward, his expression completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back." Sierra stared at the detective as if he were speaking a completely foreign language. Her brain could simply not process the command. She was the golden child, the flawless social media influencer, the perfect pastor daughter. People like her did not get arrested in their own dining rooms. But the detective did not repeat himself. He gave a swift nod, and a female officer moved forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. The sharp, metallic clinking sound finally shattered Sierra's frozen state of denial. She let out an ear-piercing shriek that rattled the crystal glasses on the mahogany table. "Get away from me!" Sierra screamed, backing away until she hit the wall. "You cannot arrest me. I am a victim here. My husband is the one who stole the money. I just planned the events. I did not know where the funding came from. You are making a huge mistake." The female officer did not hesitate. She grabbed Sierra by her upper arm and firmly spun her around, pressing her chest flat against the expensive floral wallpaper. Sierra began to thrash wildly, kicking her designer heels and twisting her shoulders. She fought with the desperate, violent panic of a spoiled child who was finally facing real consequences for the very first time in her entire pampered life. The officer easily overpowered her, twisting her wrists backward and locking the cold steel cuffs into place with a loud final click. "Mom, do something!" Sierra wailed, her perfectly contoured face contorting into an ugly mask of sheer terror and mascara-stained tears. "Mom, do not let them take me. I cannot go to jail. I will be ruined. Please help me." Yvonne completely lost her mind. She lunged forward desperately, trying to grab the police officer's arm, but another cop quickly stepped in her path, shoving her firmly back toward the center of the room. Yvonne stumbled, falling to her knees on the expensive rug. She realized instantly that her high society connections and her fake country club prestige meant absolutely nothing to these federal investigators. She could not charm or bribe her way out of this nightmare. Her golden child was being dragged away in chains. Yvonne frantically spun around on her knees and crawled across the floor toward me. She reached out with trembling hands, completely abandoning her dignity. She grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. The realization that I was now a massive titan of industry had fully cemented itself in her greedy brain. "Aisha, you have to stop this," Yvonne sobbed, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. You heard what Xavier said. You have $500 million. You are incredibly wealthy now. You can hire the absolute best defense lawyers in the country. You can pay off the police or post her bail right this second. She is your sister Aisha. She is your own flesh and blood. You have millions of dollars. Save her. Please just save her. I looked down at the woman who had happily watched me suffer in agony for years. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, no lingering sense of familial obligation. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her desperate clutching fingers off my clothing. I stepped back, putting physical distance between my success and her pathetic ruin. I glanced over at Sierra, who was still weeping and struggling against the unyielding grip of the police officer. Save her. I repeated, my voice echoing with a cold, detached finality that made Yvonne flinch. Why on earth would I do that, Mother? Less than an hour ago, she walked into this room and violently kicked my medical walker across the floor just to humiliate me. She shoved a disabled woman to the floor for a cheap laugh because she thought I was weak and helpless. She built an entire empire on stolen charity funds and fake aesthetics. She does not need my bail money. She needs a massive, brutal reality check, and federal prison is the perfect place to get it. Yvonne let out a loud, gut-wrenching wail, collapsing completely onto the floor as the absolute finality of my words crushed her last remaining hope. But the humiliation of my family was not quite finished. Preston was currently being hauled toward the front door by two heavy-set officers. He had been watching the entire pathetic exchange, and a twisted, ugly sneer spread across his face. The polished, polite facade he had maintained for years completely vanished, revealing the true venomous parasite hiding underneath. He realized his life was over, and he decided to burn his fake family to the ground on his way out. "You people make me absolutely sick," Preston spat out, digging his heels into the hardwood floor to stop his forward momentum just long enough to deliver his final venomous speech. He locked his furious eyes directly onto Yvonne, who was still weeping on the rug. "You think you are so elite?" Yvonne Preston snarled, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated racist vitriol. "You and Calvin strut around this wealthy neighborhood pretending you belong with the old money country club crowd. You bent over backward to welcome me into your family because I am a white man from a prominent family name, and you were desperately obsessed with the illusion of prestige. You let me control your church finances because you were too stupid and too greedy to actually look at the books. I never respected you. I never loved your pathetic plastic daughter. I only married her because you were the easiest, most gullible marks I have ever met in my entire life. You are nothing but a bunch of fake, desperate frauds playing dress-up in a mansion you cannot even afford." Yvonne let out a sharp, breathless gasp, as if Preston had physically kicked her in the chest. Her entire illusion of having elite, upper-class white connections was brutally shattered in front of a room full of federal officers. The man she had proudly paraded around her country club friends had just exposed his deep-seated racial contempt and his total manipulation of her pathetic social climbing insecurities. She realized with absolute horror that Preston had viewed her family as nothing more than an easy target for a financial scam. The officers had heard enough. They yanked Preston forward, roughly hauling the shouting, cursing man out the heavy oak front doors and down the grand stone steps. Sierra was dragged out right behind him, still sobbing and begging for someone to save her from the nightmare she had created. The heavy doors slammed shut with a loud, resounding echo, leaving the dining room bathed in the eerie, flashing red and blue emergency lights from the cruisers parked outside. The silence that descended upon the room was thick and suffocating. The massive house suddenly felt incredibly empty. The fake influencer empire was gone. The golden child was gone. The stolen church funds were gone. The prestigious son-in-law was gone. There was nothing left but absolute ruin. I stood perfectly still, watching the flashing lights dance across the expensive floral wallpaper. Xavier remained at my side, a silent, imposing sentinel of elite security. Yvonne remained curled on the floor, weeping quietly into the expensive wool rug. Slowly, Calvin raised his head. He had been standing near the dining table, completely paralyzed as his entire life was dismantled, piece by piece. His face was pale, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked around the empty room, processing the absolute totality of his destruction. He realized that he had nothing left to lose. The facade of the holy righteous pastor was completely gone. His eyes locked onto me, and the sheer panic in his expression rapidly morphed into something dark and intensely violent. His hands curled into tight, shaking fists at his sides. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me, his face contorting into an ugly mask of pure, unhinged fury. "You planned this!" Calvin roared, his deep voice vibrating with absolute rage. "You set this entire trap. You came here tonight to completely destroy us." I looked at the massive, trembling man who had terrorized my entire childhood, and I felt absolutely nothing. Calvin stood there with his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his face a dark, dangerous shade of purple as he tried to project the terrifying authority he had always used to crush my spirit. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined, tailored suit, as he waited for me to cower and apologize like the frightened little girl I used to be. Xavier smoothly shifted his weight, sliding his massive frame half a step forward to shield me from any sudden, violent movements. But I gently placed my hand on Xavier's arm, silently instructing my elite security director to stand down. I did not need a bodyguard to protect me from Calvin anymore. He was just a pathetic, broken old man standing in the ruins of a fraudulent life he had built entirely on lies and stolen charity money. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, completely invading his personal space, and forcing him to look directly into the eyes of the daughter he had always treated like a worthless burden. "You are wrong, Calvin," I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the empty dining room. "I did not plan this trap, and I did not come here tonight to destroy you. I came here tonight to give you one final absolute chance at redemption." As I drove up to this massive stolen mansion, I actually prayed that things would be different. I prayed that losing your church funding and facing a minor public crisis would have finally humbled you. I thought that maybe, if you were desperate enough, you might actually treat me like a human being for the very first time in my entire life. I drove to this house fully prepared to save you from the disaster you created, because despite decades of severe emotional abuse and relentless cruelty, some pathetic childish part of my soul still wanted to believe that you and Yvonne were capable of unconditional love. Calvin stared at me, his intense anger slowly faltering as deep confusion began to cloud his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a single hand demanding absolute silence. "I came into this dining room hoping to find a family." I continued my words, slicing through the heavy air like physical blades. But the very second I crossed that threshold, you showed me exactly who you truly are. You let Sierra completely mock my physical disability. You watched your golden child violently kick my medical walker across the hardwood floor just to humiliate me. And you did absolutely nothing. You did not reprimand her. You did not check to see if I was hurt. You just stood there, and you smiled because making me suffer has always been your favorite family entertainment. In that single defining moment, you proved that you have no morals, no empathy, and no souls. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my silk jacket and slowly pulled out a crisp, white piece of paper. Calvin and Yvonne both locked their eyes onto it, their breathing hitching, as they instantly recognized the heavy watermark of my elite private bank. It was a blank check from my personal account. "Before I walked through your front doors tonight, I had already run the numbers on your massive mounting debts," I explained, watching their greedy eyes widen with sudden desperate understanding. "I knew exactly how far behind you were on the mortgage. I knew about the impending foreclosure and the collapsed charity funds. I came here fully intending to write this specific check for $500,000. It would have cleared your immediate debts, paid off the angry bank, and kept a roof over your miserable heads while you figured out how to survive." Yvonne let out a sharp, strangled gasp from her spot on the floor. Her hands flew to her mouth as the horrifying reality of what she had just thrown away finally registered in her social climbing brain. I held the crisp white check up to the soft light of the crystal chandelier, giving them both a long, agonizing moment to look at their ultimate salvation. Then I took the edge of the heavy paper between my thumbs and index fingers. The sound of the thick paper tearing was deafening in the dead quiet of the room. I slowly and deliberately ripped the blank check right down the middle. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again. I kept tearing the expensive paper until it was nothing more than a handful of tiny jagged white fragments. I extended my arm over the center of the lavishly decorated dining table and slowly opened my fingers. The tiny pieces of paper fluttered down like snow, landing softly across the surface of the cold, untouched Thanksgiving turkey and the expensive porcelain plates. "Your salvation is gone," I whispered, my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. The sight of the shredded check resting on the ruined holiday feast completely broke Yvonne. She collapsed forward, pressing her face into the expensive rug, and began wailing with a raw, agonizing despair that shook her entire body. The absolute finality of her poor choices had finally crushed her completely. She realized in a sudden, brutal flash of clarity that her desperate, pathetic obsession with high society status had cost her absolutely everything. She had spent her entire life trying to impress elite country club friends who were currently laughing at her massive public downfall. She had enabled and protected Sierra's toxic behavior for 30 years, and it had resulted in her golden favorite child being dragged out of her home in federal handcuffs, facing decades in prison. She had turned a blind eye to her husband, massive financial corruption, and now they were utterly broke and publicly disgraced. But the deepest, most agonizing realization of all was that she had actively alienated and abused her real daughter, the only person in the world who had possessed both the vast wealth and the hidden desire to actually save them from ruin. Yvonne reached a trembling hand out toward me, sobbing my name over and over again, begging for a second chance that I would never give her. She wept for the mansion she was about to lose, and the fake reputation that was currently burning to the ground on live television. She finally understood that she had worshipped the wrong daughter and discarded the only one who had ever truly loved her. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman on the floor and the silent, defeated man standing frozen by the table, and I felt completely, totally free. The heavy, suffocating chains of family obligation simply evaporated into the cold air, leaving behind a brilliant, pristine emptiness in my chest. I did not owe these people a single drop of my hard-earned peace. I gave Xavier a silent nod, and he immediately turned, guiding me toward the grand foyer, with a respectful, protective hand hovering near my shoulder. I did not look back as we walked out the massive, heavy front doors, leaving my parents to drown in the absolute total devastation of their own making. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion clicked shut behind us, sealing away the sounds of Yvonne weeping and Calvin breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. The crisp November air hit my face instantly, cooling the heat that had built up inside my chest during the intense confrontation. I stood on the grand stone porch for a brief moment, looking out over the manicured lawn and the circular driveway. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were already fading down the long private road, taking Preston and Sierra away to their new, harsh, federal reality. I took a deep, long breath, pulling the freezing night air deep into my lungs. It smelled like damp fallen leaves and expensive evergreen bushes, but mostly it just smelled like pure, absolute freedom. I began to walk down the sweeping concrete steps. I did not use my medical walker because Sierra had violently kicked it across the dining room floor, and I had simply left it lying there among the ruins of their extravagant Thanksgiving feast. I did not need it anymore. I walked with smooth, steady, confident strides down the driveway, my spine perfectly straight, and my head held high. There was absolutely no limp in my gait. The physical pain that had plagued me for years seemed to have vanished, completely evaporating into the cold night air, along with my lifelong desperate need for my parents' approval. For years I had played the role of the weak, broken daughter, because that was the only version of me they could tolerate, but those days were officially over. Xavier walked silently beside me, his massive, imposing presence a comforting, solid anchor in the dark night. A sleek, custom black SUV was waiting for us at the end of the long driveway, its engine purring with a low, powerful hum. The private driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy armored door for us, bowing his head slightly as we approached. I slid into the luxurious, soft leather seat, and Xavier climbed in right behind me, sealing us inside the quiet, soundproof cabin. The heavy tinted windows instantly blocked out the oppressive sight of the fraudulent mansion behind us. The vehicle began to glide smoothly down the tree-lined street, pulling us further and further away from the toxic nightmare I had finally permanently escaped. Xavier reached forward, opening a discreet climate-controlled compartment built into the plush center console. He retrieved a chilled bottle of elite vintage champagne and two delicate crystal flutes. He popped the cork with a soft, muted sigh that barely disturbed the quiet sanctuary of the car. He poured the golden, bubbling liquid into the glasses and handed one to me. We did not speak right away. We simply tapped our crystal flutes together with a gentle ringing chime. We were not drinking to celebrate the utter destruction of my family, because finding joy in their absolute misery would mean I was just as twisted and broken as they were. We were drinking to celebrate the definitive end of a deeply toxic era. We were toasting to the absolute finality of my liberation and the beginning of my true life. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the massive, opulent estates roll by in the dark. My mind drifted back to Calvin and Yvonne still standing in that dining room, surrounded by the shredded pieces of a check that could have saved them. I did not feel pity, but I did feel a profound, lingering sense of sorrow for the absolute tragedy of their existence. Their entire lives were a masterclass in generational trauma and deep-seated internalized self-hatred. They had been so entirely conditioned by a superficial society to worship proximity to whiteness and light-skinned privilege that it had completely poisoned their souls. They were so desperately eager to cling to the illusion of elite social status that they happily allowed a mediocre, fraudulent white man like Preston to drain their finances and dictate their family dynamics. They worshipped Sierra simply because she fit the exact aesthetic they believed would grant them entry into high society circles. They chose the fake prestige of country club memberships and luxury cars over the genuine, unconditional love of their own dark-skinned daughter. They had literally sacrificed their own flesh and blood on the altar of elitist validation. Their desperate obsession with social climbing had blinded them to the massive criminal liability unfolding right under their own roof. They had destroyed themselves trying to buy their way into a world that was always laughing at them behind their backs. It was a vicious cycle of self-destruction, but by walking out those doors tonight, I had finally broken the curse for good. The quiet, peaceful silence of the car was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, rapid series of digital chimes. Xavier pulled his sleek, encrypted smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket, his dark eyes scanning the bright, glowing screen. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk began to form at the corners of his mouth as he read the incoming text alerts. He looked over at me, the blue light from the screen illuminating the sharp angles of his handsome face. The digital fallout has already breached the containment protocols, he announced, his deep voice rumbling with quiet amusement. He explained that the live stream Sierra had so foolishly triggered had been downloaded and re-uploaded across dozens of local news blogs and high society gossip forums in the greater Washington area. The scandal was spreading like absolute wildfire, consuming everything in its path. But the most devastating update of all was an official emergency press release that had just been issued. Xavier read the statement aloud, detailing how the elite local chapter of the prestigious Bull Society had convened an immediate emergency board meeting the very second the embezzlement stream went viral. They had swiftly and decisively drafted a formal public denunciation. Yvonne had been officially and permanently excommunicated from the elite social organization. They had completely stripped away the absolute last remaining shred of the fake prestigious identity she had sacrificed her entire family to protect. Her phone was undoubtedly blowing up with rejection after rejection. The social death she had always feared had finally come to claim her. Exactly 7 days after that catastrophic Thanksgiving night, I sat at the massive oak desk in my private penthouse office, watching the morning sun illuminate the city skyline. Xavier stood silently by the doorway, holding a thick leather-bound portfolio containing the final comprehensive report from my elite legal team. He walked forward and gently placed the heavy file onto the polished wood surface before taking a respectful step back. I slowly opened the cover and let my eyes trace over the detailed documents detailing the absolute total destruction of my parents' carefully curated empire. The transition had been brutally swift. Calvin and Yvonne had been formally evicted from the lavish Washington mansion they could no longer afford. The bank had seized almost everything of value to cover the massive fraudulent debts they had secretly accumulated. According to the private investigators, they had been forced to move into a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a notoriously rough neighborhood far outside the city limits. I read the detailed description of their new pathetic reality, imagining my mother horror at the peeling linoleum floors and the rattling radiator. Yvonne had spent her entire adult life aggressively climbing the social ladder, worshipping light-skinned privilege, and flaunting her fake wealth to anyone who would listen. Now she was completely isolated, disgraced, and living in the exact kind of poverty she had always openly mocked. The grand elite mansion that had served as the ultimate symbol of their arrogant vanity was currently being completely emptied by professional liquidators. The report detailed how moving crews had spent the entire weekend carrying out the antique mahogany dining table, the crystal chandeliers, and the expensive velvet curtains, leaving the massive house entirely stripped and hollow, just like the people who used to live inside it. I turned the page of the legal dossier and moved on to the section detailing the criminal fallout. The justice system had absolutely no mercy for a high-profile scam artist who had brazenly stolen millions of dollars from vulnerable working-class investors. Sierra had appeared in federal court 2 days earlier for her official bail hearing. My legal team had sent an associate to observe the proceedings, and the written account was incredibly satisfying to read. Sierra had apparently wept hysterically throughout the entire hearing, begging the judge for leniency and loudly blaming everyone else for her massive criminal enterprise. She had stood before the court wearing a standard-issue bright orange county jail jumpsuit, completely stripped of her expensive hair extensions and her flawless designer makeup. She looked like a terrified, broken shell of the arrogant golden child she used to be. The judge, however, remained entirely unmoved by her pathetic theatrical performance. Because the sheer scale of her fraudulent Ponzi scheme was so massive, and because she possessed the means and the deceptive skills to potentially flee the country, the judge had decisively denied her bail. Sierra was officially remanded to federal custody, where she would remain locked in a cold concrete cell until her criminal trial began. The golden daughter, who had once kicked my medical walker across a hardwood floor for a cheap laugh, was now learning exactly what true helplessness actually felt like. She was entirely at the mercy of a justice system that did not care about her Instagram followers or her carefully curated aesthetic. The next few pages of the dossier contained the most spectacular twist of the entire miserable saga. Preston had completely folded the absolute second the federal agents had placed him in an interrogation room. Like the true coward he had always been, he immediately accepted a comprehensive plea deal, aggressively throwing my sister and my parents straight under the bus in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin. He detailed every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake charity account, and every stolen donation, confirming everything my forensic auditors had already uncovered. But the federal background checks had unearthed a deeply hidden secret that even I had not anticipated. Preston was not just a con artist and an embezzler. The federal prosecutors had discovered undeniable legal proof that Preston had a secret legal wife and 2 young children living under a different name in another state. He was a complete total fraud on every conceivable level and had officially committed bigamy when he married my oblivious sister. Sierra had thrown away her entire life to marry a man who was already legally married to someone else. Despite his eager cooperation with the authorities, The sheer volume of his federal crimes combined with the bigamy charges meant that the plea deal was far from generous. Preston was still facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 long, grueling years in a federal penitentiary. His arrogant belief that he was the smartest man in the room had ultimately secured him a decade behind bars. I closed the heavy leather portfolio and pushed it aside, feeling a profound, deep sense of closure wash over my spirit. The toxic generational curse that had poisoned my family for decades was finally officially broken. But I had one final, absolute masterstroke left to execute. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick stack of real estate transfer documents. Through a series of aggressive, anonymous corporate maneuvers, my elite financial team had successfully purchased the foreclosed Washington mansion directly from the bank. I picked up my favorite heavy gold fountain pen and smoothly signed my name on the bottom line of the final deed. I was officially transferring total complete ownership of the lavish estate to a highly respected nonprofit organization. It was an elite charity dedicated exclusively to providing safe, accessible housing and comprehensive medical support for disabled African American women. My parents' precious status symbol. The very house where they had mocked my disability and worshipped their own vanity was now going to become a permanent, beautiful sanctuary for the exact marginalized women they had always despised. It was the ultimate, perfect poetic justice. I set the gold pen down on the desk and took a slow, deep breath of the quiet morning air. I pushed my chair back and stood up, walking smoothly across the plush carpet toward my expansive master suite. Today was not a day for looking back at the ashes of the past. Today was the most important morning of my entire professional life, and I needed to prepare for my massive global press conference. I walked into my massive custom walk-in closet and let my eyes scan the immaculate rows of designer clothing. I bypassed the practical flats and the orthotic footwear I had been forced to rely on for so many agonizing years. Instead, I reached up and pulled down a pair of stunning, lethal red designer stilettos. The doctors and my cruel parents had repeatedly sworn that I would never walk independently again, let alone wear something so beautiful. I slipped my feet into the elegant shoes, stood perfectly tall, and smiled as I took a flawless, confident step forward. I took another step and then another, letting the sharp click of the heels echo against the marble floor of my massive dressing room. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling mirror and simply stared at the woman looking back at me. She was powerful, she was beautiful, and most importantly, she was completely unbroken. The dark circles of pain and exhaustion that used to shadow my eyes were completely gone, replaced by a fierce, radiant energy. The tailored emerald green suit I wore fit perfectly, exuding an absolute quiet authority. I had spent my entire life trying to shrink myself down, to make my family comfortable, trying to hide my brilliance so Sierra could shine. But looking at my reflection now, I knew I would never shrink for anyone ever again. The heavy oak door of the master suite clicked open and Xavier walked in. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, looking incredibly handsome and quietly formidable. He walked up behind me, his broad shoulders framing my reflection in the mirror. He wrapped his strong arms around my waist, pulling my back against his solid chest, and gently pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my bare shoulder. I leaned back into his warmth, feeling completely safe and entirely loved. "Are you ready to change the world?" he asked, his deep voice vibrating against my spine. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," I replied, reaching up to rest my hand over his. We left the penthouse and took the private elevator down to the underground garage where a sleek, armored town car was already waiting. The drive to the private airfield was smooth and quiet. We boarded my personal jet for the quick flight to New York City. As we began our descent, the sprawling, glittering skyline of Manhattan came into view. This was the city of titans, the city of massive industry, and today it belonged to me. The town car navigated the busy morning traffic, pulling up to the iconic street corner in Times Square. The massive digital billboards were already flashing bright, vibrant colors across the bustling pavement. But today, they were not showing advertisements for luxury cars or cheap fashion brands. Every single massive glowing screen wrapped around the building was displaying my company logo. The streets were absolutely packed. As soon as Xavier opened my car door, a blinding sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters instantly surrounded us. Elite security personnel formed a tight, impenetrable wall around me, guiding us safely through the chaotic, excited crowd. Aisha, over here. Aisha, look this way, the paparazzi screamed, thrusting microphones over the shoulders of my security team. How does it feel to launch a $500 million initial public offering? Aisha, can you give us a statement about the groundbreaking medical tech? I did not stop to answer their frantic questions, but I kept a serene, confident smile on my face as I walked smoothly up the steps. I was not limping. I was not hiding. I was moving with the absolute effortless grace of a woman who had fought a brutal war for her own body and won. My biotech firm had not just developed a revolutionary treatment for my specific rare mobility condition. We had successfully patented and scaled a highly advanced medical technology that was going to permanently cure thousands of people suffering from similar debilitating diseases. The massive $500 million valuation was not just a number on a spreadsheet. It was undeniable concrete proof that my pain had been transformed into an absolute global triumph. Xavier escorted me inside the historic building, leading me away from the noisy, chaotic street and into the hushed, exclusive atmosphere of the stock exchange. My elite executive team was already waiting for me near the grand balcony, their faces glowing with absolute pride and electric anticipation. The energy in the room was completely vibrating. We were minutes away from making financial history. An official event coordinator politely directed me toward the center podium. The heavy polished wood felt solid and grounding under my fingertips. I looked out over the massive, busy trading floor, watching hundreds of brokers and financial analysts looking up at the balcony, waiting for me to give the signal. The digital clock on the wall was rapidly ticking down to the exact opening minute of the trading day. A bank of heavy television cameras was positioned directly in front of the podium, broadcasting this historic moment live to millions of financial networks and morning news channels all across the country. I looked directly into the dark lens of the center camera, and a slow, profound realization settled deep into my bones. Somewhere far outside the city limits of Washington, in a tiny, cramped, depressing two-bedroom apartment, Calvin and Yvonne were undoubtedly watching this exact live broadcast. I could perfectly picture them sitting on a cheap, sagging sofa, staring at a small rented television screen in absolute silent agony. They had spent their entire lives worshiping the very same elite wealth and corporate power that I was currently commanding on live national television. They were watching the daughter they had violently discarded ring the opening bell of the global stock exchange. They were watching the crippled burden they had hidden away stand perfectly tall in designer stilettos while the entire world celebrated her massive, unmitigated success. They were stuck in a dark, miserable little box, drowning in poverty and public disgrace, while I was bathed in the blinding light of total victory. The digital clock struck the final zero. A loud, booming voice echoed through the massive room, announcing the official opening of the market and officially welcoming my elite biotech firm to the global exchange. I stepped forward, my posture flawless, and firmly pressed the heavy illuminated button. The iconic ringing bell echoed powerfully across the massive trading floor. Immediately, the entire room erupted into deafening cheers and thunderous applause. Thousands of bright, shimmering pieces of gold and silver confetti rained down from the high ceiling, catching the bright studio lights and fluttering beautifully through the air. The massive digital screens surrounding the entire room instantly changed, flashing bright, brilliant text that completely illuminated the space. Aisha Caldwell, founder and chief executive officer. I looked at my name shining brightly above the cheering crowd, and I felt a profound, perfect sense of peace completely wash over my soul. I did not need to destroy my family to find justice. Their own toxic greed and their violent, shallow vanity had already done that work for me. The ultimate absolute revenge was not watching them suffer in the ruins of their fake empire. The sweetest, most perfect revenge was simply rising so incredibly high that their toxic cruelty and their pathetic hatred could never ever touch me again. I stood there under the falling gold confetti, holding Xavier's hand, and I finally truly began to live. The greatest lesson here is that your true worth is never determined by the toxic people who choose to misunderstand you. Sometimes the absolute bravest thing you can ever do is simply walk away from abusive environments. True vindication does not require violently destroying those who deeply hurt you. It only requires quietly building a beautiful, successful life that they can no longer touch. Blood does not always mean family, and choosing yourself is a profound act of self-love. Kindly share your personal survival story in the comments section below, and please subscribe for more empowering video content today.